How's it, Paul? How are you doing this evening?
I'm well, Mike, and you seem to be on top of the world also from the smile on your face.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know about that. I'm going on leave in a couple of days, so it's been a long year. So it's
Yeah,
I'm going to
yeah,
enjoy the I'm going to enjoy the break. Paul, I think we're reconvening on our analysis of the burning building in Johannesburg that happened in geez, let me get it in August, right?
yeah,
31st of August, I think it happened.
yeah.
And I think we've done some initial analysis on it, and I think we're just going to chat a bit more
Yes.
about that analysis. I think you've finished off a second article on it now, and I think the article focuses more on how the story is presented in the news. And I think there's quite a lot to unpack there. And I would like to, I've read through it a couple of times, and as I told you earlier, it's quite analytical, and I think there's a lot to digest there. And I think as we talk about certain themes within your article, it would be interesting for you to kind of just riff on some of that, so that we can get some insights into what you've written there. So as I said, there's a lot to unpack. Um, what I'd like to start off with is your analysis of the political economy of media bias, right? And I think in your previous article, you highlighted a framework of five filters, and how these filters um, exclude certain facts from and permit others to be in a news story, which I found quite interesting because in general, the news analysis that I've been doing recently and over a large period of time, actually, as I've been looking at methods to analyze news.
Mm.
Um, the first time I actually read through these filters, and I think we had a discussion about it previously, and I included some other more what I would call modern filters in it, but I actually don't even want to go there. The more I think about the ones that you've mentioned, it's kind of hit me a little bit harder as I've looked closer at what I consider to be mainstream, uh, sometimes referred to as legacy media. And first of all, how the reporting is done, why certain points are left out and some are included, what sources are used and what sources aren't used, and the general, I would say, just lack of real critical analysis of a particular story in most, if not all, legacy. There are very few kind of outlets that would do a deep dive analysis into certain things, and that could be for a couple of reasons. Because so what I was saying was the lack of real in-depth critical analysis of an event. Because usually it's just like a very brief. Most of the articles that we, certainly the ones that the news outlets that we looked at now recently, there were a couple of them, I think up to five of them. They present a very scant perspective of an event, and that could be for a couple of reasons. But I think that falls into your into the five filters that you've highlighted there. Now that's one talking point that we can address. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, because there's a whole bunch of other things that I'd like to unpack, and we could probably talk for 3 hours just on this particular point. But I
Yeah,
don't know if you want to maybe say something about these
sure.
five filters.
Yeah, no, let me say something about that. I think the five filters was really for me a starting point, like a very, very broad, maybe even abstract framework. And I came across this very interesting article by uh, Jane Duncan, who's actually
Yeah.
quite has established a name for herself as a critical analyst of the news. I think Jane's been a past chairperson of the Freedom of Expression Institute, and she's an academic also who headed up a media or journalist department at Rhodes, and might currently be on the staff of University of Johannesburg um, journalism. But in any event, what I found in her article, which was an attempt to analyze the political economy of the reporting of the Marikana massacre, which is a good 10 years ago, and she wrote it in 2016. What I found in her analysis was that she gave far more. She took the very broad 5 filters framework, if you like, okay, and she started unpacking it still conceptually, but using the Marikana content as an example of how she would apply it. She started unpacking those 5 more general filter concepts into more detailed concepts, okay? Um, and and um, and so what I tried to show in the diagram was the way she, I thought very usefully, unpacked a more detailed theory of political economy analysis of the media, of a media article. So, for instance, there are 3 levels that I picked up in her work. The one is the reporting or the field work, okay, going to collect the information. The second one is the quantitative um, analysis, and I see I made a mistake in my diagram. I've got 2 qualitative analysis levels. But the first one's actually the quantitative analysis, and the second one is the qualitative analysis. And what she really says is that reporting has 2 aspects to it. One is forensic, where you follow, like forensics, you follow the paper trail. You're quite sort of factual, evidence-based, if you like. You follow the paper trail. And then there's a thing called social reporting, where you are critically analyzing underlying trends. And it takes you into questions of class and social power, to try and understand why certain people do certain things that you're reporting on, and why others don't. And then getting into the quantitative analysis, she has things like sources used. Are they elite sources, or are they talking to the grassroots? And who the, what you call, secondly, who the primary definers? Which of these sources are quoted frequently enough to realize that story is defined by them? And then she has an area called lexical choice. How you express the emotion evoked by what you're reporting, which can introduce quite a lot of problematic subjectivity. Okay, and then finally, she talks about the qualitative analysis. Once you've collected all this information, and it's been filtered by the definers that you've unconsciously or consciously focused on, and it's been filtered on who your main sources of data are, then you are challenged with analyzing the meaning of it, okay? And you can either stay very, very close to the content and see what the data is denoting, or you can go into what she calls the manifest content, which is, what are the deeper implications of the data, which might only come to you as the reporter or the writer whilst you're writing this thing, rather than whilst you're collecting it. And that leads to the types of themes that come out. And I used examples of 5 themes that I thought came out of the 5 platforms that we examined, actually a total now of 24 articles, okay? And so I thought that was really, quite interesting. And she makes a point that I also hold, that you need to use concepts of class and social power in your qualitative analysis. you can't exclude social power and fully understand a news event. And that's the point I think I made on the first sort of article that I wrote. Now, this particular diagram, as you know from looking at the article, gets followed up by a second one, which goes into, and I'll stop, but I just want to mention it. I won't go into it because you may have more questions on what I've just raised, but the second diagram goes more deeply into looking at what are the factors that shape the actual news reporting at each of these levels. Your collection of data, how do your sources limit and shape where you're going, et cetera, et cetera. And that I also gleaned from her article. So this second diagram is taking that first one and drilling it down to a far more detailed theory, if you like. Okay, so that by the time you've combined these two diagrams, you got a pretty detailed framework of how you should analyze a particular article. And the final point I want to make relates to using AI in a more effective way, because we're learning as we go along about AI, and it's definitely a very useful tool. And I've no doubt that it's correct to use it, and that it can be driven by us rather than being driven by it and all that. But it tells you these two diagrammatized frameworks. I think they tell you, when you understand them, what are the key questions that you would like the initial reader, the AI, to actually start asking, and in detail, very, very specific detail, and very specific definitions of what you mean when you ask AI to look at a couple of conceptual questions.
Yeah, exactly. I think let me start with your last point first, then, and then I can work my way backwards there. I think what's interesting for me is because I'm very interested in being able to create a framework for news analysis, but uh, in very much an academic sense, because I think that's what I think is needed to really glean a proper analysis or the required analysis. I mean, you can ask a general questions like we've done, and it's not bad, right? It's not bad, I think, but I think my intention would be to start priming it a little bit more with a more academic kind of how can I put it? Academic framework, let's call it that, using quantitative and qualitative analysis. I think that's quite important. And just some other things that I think have been highlighted in your article. Because the only thing that I am seeing, but let me go back to the five filters, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Because what has been interesting, I'm gonna name them out as we've got them here. So we've got a framework of 5 filters that progressively exclude certain facts from and permit others to be in a news story, right? So let's take this story. Let's take this story as an example, because obviously that's what we're talking about. And I might be all over the place, but I want to also just address the concepts of class and social power. I think the concepts of class and social power would certainly be important in this story, and it certainly would be important in the Marikana story. Is it important in every single story? I don't know if I agree 100% there, but I'm open to persuasion there, right?
Okay.
Because or at least would the concept of class and social power be such a strong element in every single story? I don't know. Maybe, but I think there would certainly be degrees there would be degrees of that, right? I think that's all I really want to say about that for now, because it's also there could be a lot to unpack there, right?
Yes.
But the five filters that we're talking about here, I'm going to read them out again. All right. So these are the five filters that exclude certain facts from and permit others to be in a news story. Size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media. So size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media. The advertising license to do business, sourcing mass media news, FLAC and the enforcers, and ideology of neoliberalism as a control mechanism. So what am I trying to say about this? As I kind of remember us reviewing, or remember myself looking at all these news articles, I think size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media. I mean, how would you interpret that first filter in this particular story? Maybe you can comment on that. I've got something to say about that, but maybe you can comment on that first filter: size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media.
Look, I think that first filter doesn't operate, as we said in the last article, it doesn't operate in a vertical command. What's the term that I used in that last article? In a vertical command process. Okay. So what I'm saying there, what I mean by that, I don't think that the group CEO of the group that owns the company that owns that particular newspaper is sending down directives around how the burning of Usindiso should be reported. Okay, what that level of ownership, corporate ownership, is concerned about is the profitability, the contribution to the overall group profitability of a newspaper like what was the one that we looked at there? The Sowetan, okay? And if it's not performing, then, at a certain level of profit contribution, then they're going to make some intervention in terms of appointments and penalizing whoever is the editor or the leader, who then might have to do a similar thing to the manager at the sub-editor level of the journalist. And so there's a very indirect filtering process that's going on there. And I think what's useful about Duncan's more detailed framework is that she starts showing how the more direct impacts that filter in the process of a particular story.
Yeah. I mean that makes sense. I think in this particular story, and I suppose others, I don't know if I don't know what this story, I think, would demand reporting on, right? What I find more interesting is the I can even call it the quality of reporting, which I think would be in all of the news outlets that we looked at. I must just say, the quality of reporting, apart from possibly the BBC, but it also had its own issues, was, I would call, and I'm not a reporter, I'm not a journalist, okay? Although, I think we spent some time doing proper analysis on things. I would say the reporting was subpar, okay?
Yeah.
And that was highlighted by the AI. Now, the reason that it's now maybe the word of subpar is subjective. It maybe needs more more unpacking. But what I can say is that there was certainly analysis that was missing to give give the reader or the consumer a better overall view of the event, if I can put it like that, and maybe that can be said even better. Now, is that the and I think maybe the other filters would come into play here as well. I mean, the advertising license to do business. When you say the advertising license to do business, Are we talking about advertising in general? Like, are we talking about that the advertising is an income model that a lot of these, if not all of them, use, right? And that certainly would affect possibly uh, their what's the word, their editorial process, right? When it comes to what stories are picked, and what can be said within those stories. I think Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it nowadays, is kind of feeling that, and I think Elon Musk has spoken out quite strongly about that. But I think that kind of is, it's quite a hot topic in the United States and around the world now, about advertisers not wanting to be associated with certain narratives, stories, and it also comes to, I think, what we spoke about earlier in the week about the concept of free speech. So I think advertising would definitely play a large role in the editorial of these outlets. Sourcing of mass media news. Okay, I mean, I understand that to be, how would you understand sourcing of mass media news? Meaning, what stories are being editorialized, or actually going out to find stories?
Well, who you actually getting the information from. So what's again useful
Yeah, okay,
of
I
Duncan
understand. Okay,
is that she says they're going primarily to elite sources. By that she means corporate,
yes,
academic think tanks, and official government. Um, and that's partly related to profitability. So these 5 filters, we've
yeah,
separated them out for purposes of understanding and analysis, but this whole thing is a syncretically whole process. And that diagram that we were speaking about, Jane Duncan's diagram that we were addressing earlier, is really breaking up, for analytical purposes, also a syncretic process where the advertising revenue being a fairly significant revenue, if not the sole revenue for media today, in terms of a neoliberal ideological view of what is the natural thing to do, okay, is a strong driver to more elite sources. And why? She actually explains it quite well. She says because um, the advertisers are looking at a certain um, middle to upper income level, because people below that uh, often can't afford what the advertisers are advertising as their services and their products. I mean, it's more complicated than that, as she recognizes, because there are tabloids like Die Son and all of that goes for a poorer working class environment. But just leaving that aside for the moment, um, because your middle and upper income readership is the sort of prized readership that the advertisers want to actually be exposed to. They're concerned about not just what you are writing about, but how you're writing about it. And she makes the point that around Marikana, for instance, at that time, and I don't think it's changed much, the real upper income prized readership was still mainly white and male. And that brings a certain socialized view. Okay. So you don't want to frighten them off with the wrong stories if you want to get the advertising from the people who are, in fact, targeting them as as consumers of their products. So I think I just try to give that as an example about how all these filters and all those factors in that diagram of Duncan's actually all they cross cut and feed into each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting. I mean, I don't think we have to go through all of them now. Paul, obviously, AI is the big buzzword now, and I think analytical AI in what we're trying to do is I find quite interesting. And what I was saying was that I'm trying to develop a framework, a more academic type of framework that can assist the prompt engineering of the AI to give a certain analysis on news articles. However, my concern is that the mainstream legacy media, especially and this is something we can maybe just segue into as well. The sources that we've looked at, and I think sources in general, they lack a real critical analysis of news events. And very few sources provide that critical analysis. Whether that critical analysis is agreeable or not, very few sources even go to the point of giving any sort of critical analysis, right? I think there's some sort of opinion pieces in some of these sources, but in general, of the South African sources that we've looked at, they're quite scant in detail and critical analysis. So it's going to be what I'm thinking right now. It'll probably be difficult to apply a more academic framework in the prompt engineering with these sources. However, I think it's worth looking at anyways, because that in itself should highlight the fact that these sources are inadequate, right?
Exactly.
Inadequate for people to really gain the certain insight that maybe is needed in the reporting or the stories. I mean, at the same time, I mean, I think, back to the filters again, but I think we've put enough focus on them. I mean, my thoughts would be that how many people in the general public are willing to invest enough time in actually critically thinking about events. I would say relatively few. People are busy. People have got other things going on in their lives. And how many people are really interested in that? And at the same time, a lot of even possibly some of the sources that do put a little bit more time into their critical analysis, how many of them are actually giving anything of real certain value that makes you think, or that is able to persuade you into a certain in a certain way, right? Because I think at the end of the day, I mean, propaganda maybe is a strong word, but at the end of the day, I think anyone putting out any sort of analysis of anything really is there to persuade the reader or the consumer of that material in a certain fashion. Now, there's ways of doing that. I think you can be maybe more objective in your analysis, and I think that's the gold standard, and it always has been in journalism, where your analysis is fact-based and objective as much as possible, so that the consumer or the reader can come up with his own point of view and come up with his own opinion on the story. Now, that's difficult, and that I think goes into this idea of impartiality as balance, right? Which is the principle of presenting news stories in a way that gives equal weight or representation to different perspectives or sides of an issue, right? Now, that all sounds all great in practice, and I think it is important to take that in consideration. However, that I think could also be abused, right? In the sense that in the pursuit of balance, it can sometimes lead to false equivalences, right? Especially in situations where one perspective is more factually supported from another. And this could also give undue credibility to viewpoints that lack evidentiary support. And I think that's used a lot and that I think when that is happening, you're moving more into the field of propaganda than real. If your intention is more than your intention to just put out the facts in the most objective way, and that I think gets onto the point of objectivity, and maybe we can talk about that, right? Like, can someone be purely objective? And I think this is a contentious issue. My feeling is probably not, especially the more contentious the issue is. I think objectivity starts becoming maybe even a problem, to the point where, do I want to be objective on this issue? Do I want to put some sort of objectivity on this issue, or do I actually want to put my opinion on this because I value my opinion more than being objective, because I want to now influence, I want to convince, so we're in this murky kind of space of what is my intention behind the words or the ideas that I'm putting out. And that, to go even deeper now, is that going to be interpreted as hate speech? Is that going to be interpreted will that be interpreted as or free speech, right? And I think it's the struggle of our current zeitgeist, I believe, of what is free speech nowadays, or what is hate speech, and is it simply just the powerful, whoever's powerful enough at the current time to be able to make those definitions of those two phrases. I don't know if you want to maybe comment on that.
Yeah, look, I think we've chatted about these issues constantly over the years. I think you're right. They are important issues. I think I agree with you. Nobody can be purely, with the emphasis on purity, objective. There's always a subjective interest in a certain narrative, okay? But you can strive to be objective, authentically strive to be objective. And I think the way you do it is you commit to free speech. And what does free speech mean? Free speech means defending the right of those who oppose your narrative to oppose it, even if it's a very difficult oppositional narrative, or one that you find morally reprehensible for whatever reason. And that's not about the purity of objectivity. That's just about an engagement of different minds, of as many different minds as possible, including the grassroots. So that out of this type of free speech engagement, there is an assumption that the rational side of human nature will have a very good chance of predominating, and that reasonable people will come to the same or different conclusions and live with their differences. There's no guarantee on that, of course. For reasons beyond our control, the irrational side might predominate in this debate, which might become more of a shouting match. But then those who committed to a rational debate have to take up that struggle, I suppose, that ideological struggle. To come back to this particular article and your question of objectivity, the BBC article, the article that analyzes the BBC's paradigm, and you said correctly that that paradigm they've summarized as impartiality as balance. So if you talk to everybody with a point of view, then basically you are impartial, okay? And objectivity, you being objective, is somehow tied in with that. The critique that article raises is that what the BBC ends up doing is having a very narrow party political focus, and they identify two voices who they try to give equal opportunity to. One's the Conservative Party, and others the Labour Party. They don't talk to the minor parties, They don't talk to unions much, and they don't talk to other grassroots organizations that are even more marginalized from the political center in the UK. And so they end up with a very biased set of views rather than a balanced set of views. And that article isn't hitting the idea of impartiality as balance. It's simply saying you need to talk about the impartiality of balance by including as many possible views on a topic that you're focusing on as possible, and not decide who the important views are. And they use the term of a wheel with spokes. So wheel has many spokes, and each spoke goes out to some constituency out there to talk about. So presumably the debate about Brexit in the UK should have included a lot of politically marginalized groups on both the pro-Brexit and the Remain viewpoints, and interrogated them and made them, like, explicate themselves in the public domain, and leave a listenership with these views, so that they have them, and that isn't a sort of pure objective, you finally got all the facts right recipe. It's about a democratic free speech debate that could and that would show up that facts also depends on the person who's, and the viewpoint of that person who's projecting that fact, but that ultimately starting the process of separating fact from fiction is a democratic process of free speech. You can challenge that, but that's certainly a view that I hold, and I think it's a view that you hold, although let me not speak on your behalf, but that's what I've heard you sort of, in a way, talk about in the past. And, implicit in that is that at the end of the day, we agree to disagree.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in hearing from you, though I don't want to preempt you at all, is the conclusion, okay? Because in the conclusion, I tried to address a very simple question. What am I actually trying to say here in terms of seeing a problem, and in terms of, through seeing it in a certain way and understanding it, creating the basis for a framework for resolving it, or for thinking through the resolution of the problem. So let me just leave that with you, but there may be other points that you want to raise, and hear my response.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I think I need to spend a little bit more time on that conclusion, because I think I think what I'm reading here is, and you can tell me if I'm right or not, and maybe you can talk more about it, right? Is that you emphasize the need for, like, public development solutions to provide safe, decent, and affordable housing. And you critique the influence of neoliberal ideologies and policies within the media narratives, right? And I think the neoliberal ideologies is something interesting to talk about, because what I found interesting was that how I think what you're saying here is that, like, the neoliberalism, or the neoliberal kind of ideology or outlook, tends to undermine the government's capacities, okay, for regulating things. And it focuses on some sort of entrepreneurial practices that prioritize profitability over safety measures. In this sense, but in a broader sense, are we saying that the neoliberal ideology within, let's say, the media is happy to almost demonize the government, and sometimes maybe in a valid way, because on some issues, if not most issues, government can be quite useless, right? But are you saying that there's almost an intentional or purposeful critique of government methods because of a neoliberal outlook or ideology that is almost encouraging a more privatization of uh, what's the word? Privatization of services that in fact the state should be giving to their citizens. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what you say does make sense. I think it's a correct interpretation. But I just want to say that I don't think that that there's this sort of instrumentalization, if you like, or weaponization, conscious weaponization of neoliberalism in order to do these things. Okay, I think, and you remember a discussion group out in Cork Bay about 6 years ago that you actually videoed. You and Nadia were at. I think it's a world view, and boiled down to its essence, it's really saying, look, everybody needs to look after themselves in the first instance. Once you've looked after yourself, and you've got to, including the state, should be an entrepreneur. Once you've looked after yourself and you've built up your wealth, then you can actually contribute to others. Okay. And it goes against the idea of social solidarity, that you help people regardless of what you can get out of it, or regardless of your state of readiness. But as a public authority, your role should be to, out of social solidarity, provide welfare um, to those who need it, and not only be driven by the need to make revenue exceed expenditure. And notice I say not only. I'm not saying revenue needing to cover expenditure is not important. Obviously it is, okay? But in the sort of pre-neoliberal era, what they call Keynesianism, there was a thing called deficit budgeting. You could go into deficit in order to keep the economy going and prime it, so that when the next boom came, your tax receipts were so much higher, you could repay the debt that you'd incurred. Okay. Whereas on the neoliberal view, that's a no-no. You don't do that. Sorry. You've got to tighten the belt. Okay. And there's also another example which I'm not sure I dealt with at that discussion. I'm talking about the macro picture now, not specifically about the media and even a particular article, but it's important because all of this, the media as a sector and particular articles are embedded in a much bigger society, and I think it's important to understand that the critique that Duncan is presenting, and I'm supporting her on and presenting here, of that article, is also a critique of the broader direction of our society. Okay, so the one point I just wanted to mention to you is that in an earlier period, even before the welfareism, Roosevelt's New Deal, or the British Labour Party's welfare state, or European social democracy of the first half of the 20th century, even before that, in the late 19th century, effectively there were government banks. Governments created money. And in the case of Germany and the US, it funded enormous growth, economic growth, in their early phases of their development as capitalist economies. And there's a very strong critique of privatized banking at the moment in the US, actually, by quite a lot of people are not all that far off of mainstream in order to get funding to go into productive economic investments and not into speculative investments, which is where it's been ending up, more and more over the last 30 or 40 years. And there's an argument that that is what kicked off and triggered off the 2008 recession. It was just too much of a speculative bubble. But I want to come back to your question to me, okay? You asked me whether I was saying that this is a ideology and a view that is actually undermining government's role in economic sort of and housing development and all of that. And my answer to you was yes, but also no, in the sense that I don't think it's consciously directed that way. They understand that government is also inherently an entrepreneur, and that for government to function efficiently, it has got to be entrepreneurial. And they're not saying that it needs to cut corners in regulation. They say, no, you must regulate, and you must control for the sake of the economy. You must control malpractice and building standards, health standards. They're not saying avoid that, okay? But the unintended consequence, maybe you could say, of this heightened competition pressure all across the economy starts putting a dampening on investments that don't give you immediate return. Okay, so you can like really cut those costs down to a bone in order to expand your surplus as an entrepreneur, including in an entrepreneurial state. And regulation is an investment. Regulation is not a revenue generator. Inspectors have got to be hired, they've got to be trained, they've got to go out and look at buildings, and they've got to do it diligently. And in the case of the inner city of Joburg, there are a lot of buildings that have deteriorated decades ago already. It started, and it requires quite a huge army of people who dedicated and who get paid properly to do this. You can't expect them to be overworked and paid maybe a bit short, because they're going to become prone to taking incentives from the private sector who has got hold of these buildings. And some of that private sector, we know, is organized crime. In fact, many of it, we don't know to what extent it's organized crime. I mean, that's another interesting thing about the superficial reporting, How many buildings out of all the buildings in Joburg have been identified as criminal syndicate controlled? And that's a regulator's task to do. And so what I'm suggesting, if I had a research budget and a team of people, I would put that question out there and send people out doing research, okay? Because I think there's my political economy theory tells me why that is important, okay? And the research could come back and disprove me. That's fine. But you've got to have an explicit theoretical framework in anything you're doing. And your research needs to test it out. And so what I pick up from Duncan and the BBC paper for me was reinforcing specific aspects of the Duncan framework and very consistent with it. And so that is the value, I think, of having this framework and spelling it out, graphically, because that's about the most objective you can become, where you're not walking around and implicitly saying things that you're not unpacking. Because I think that is where bias that is not expressed comes in. We're all going to be biased. So let's say I'm biased theoretically towards the truth in that way. Here it is. Here's my evidence. Here's my argument. And I think news needs to be driven that way instead of through superficial sound bites of impartiality as balance. Obviously, you need to be impartial if you're reporting and there's a party there who you're politically opposed to. You've got to put that in the parking lot, obviously. But the thing is made into a dogma that is subject to enormous economic pressure, which Duncan actually spells out quite well, and incredible pressure on deadlines. The paper's got to come out. Maybe you've got to be driven less by time. I mean, it took me 5 solid days, I think, or 4 solid days to write this thing. It's about 2.5 or 2,700 words. People say if you're over 800 words, sorry, you can't publish. Other people say 200 is the maximum. That's part of the problem.
Yeah. I think just on that particular point, I think for this particular story, I think there was one female journalist that wrote 2 pieces that had some sort of substance. I can't recall what news outlet.
Tessa Dooms.
Yes, that's right. Tessa Dooms, right?
And it was either, I think it may have been the Sowetan, but there was one article from the BBC that I think had a different name attached to it. But I thought, this is interesting.
Yeah.
You know, look, let me take back the 2,700 words. You can do a series of 800-word articles that are linked in fairly rapid succession over a period of 10 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever that pick up this trend. You know, so there are many ways to skin a cat. It doesn't have to be. Obviously, I realize that it's idealistic to expect journalists to be doing this type of thing, but there are ways in which an editorial management, could structure it if they were incentivized and not penalized.
Yeah, exactly, and that's very interesting, because I think in a way that they would be penalized. And look, it's difficult to say. Say for a story like this, you could probably have at least 2 or 3 senior journalists actually go and do a deep dive on this thing and follow the story to its final conclusion, or whatever that may be. Who knows what that could be? But I mean, I don't know. I mean, that would probably be a little bit too much effort. I think the news cycle moves so fast that this story is already forgotten. In fact, the intended
Commission of Inquiry.
Commission of Inquiry seems to have just fallen flat on its face, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that in itself is kind of its own kind of stark kind of like just realization of how these kind of things are managed in a way, and it's its own story, in fact, right? It could be pursued. It could be pursued, but I mean, I think the news cycle also moves too.
Sorry, can I just say something there before I forget? Because to get back to this critique of government and this point you raised earlier about these people who direct or write the news stories, having a agenda, maybe, possibly didn't use the word, but let me use it, an agenda to sort of undermine government, okay? And they're not difficult to undermine because they seem to be, if not corrupt, then certainly at the very least inefficient, if not incompetent, okay? And what I was trying to say earlier on, and I touched on it in that presentation from 6 years ago, is that in the entrepreneurial state, and I think, Ramaphosa as this, I'm not sure if Ramaphosa is he's not a dollar billionaire. I'm not even sure if he's a rand billionaire, but he got hundreds of thousands of rand of wealth, definitely. And he's the president of the country, and he runs an entrepreneurial state. So this entrepreneurial state is not really, it's focused on being an entrepreneurial state. It hasn't got time to do the things that you're talking about. And at the same time, it's facing all sorts of competition from opponent entrepreneurs in the state, Read Zuma and the Radical Economic Transformation faction. And those fights can get quite intense, if not vicious.
Because I think there's this kind of contradiction in, you talk about an entrepreneurial state, right? And what I would find interesting is the average citizen wouldn't consider the state to be entrepreneurial, right?
No.
In fact, I think there's like this classic understanding of what the state is. Maybe a bit dumbed down, if I can use that phrase, where the job of the state is to take our taxes and to use them in a beneficial way that that benefits the society and the citizens, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's understood to be a business. I don't think it's understood to be. I mean, I think maybe most people wouldn't consider the state to be run like a business. However, I think that is the reality
Do
of
you
most states
do you
around the
know
world.
do you know that the South African government is incorporated in, I think, the New York Stock Exchange? SA
Yeah,
Incorporated.
and I think most governments are like that, right? I mean, I think we can go down rabbit holes there, but that I don't think that's the general understanding of
No,
the
it's not.
population that is the case, right? So I find it interesting the term entrepreneurial state, because then you're running a state like a business that
Yes,
needs to be that needs to be making revenue, that needs to
yes.
be making growth, like as if it
Oh,
was, it's, making, as talk about GDP or whatever.
yes,
And it is then prone to all the economic hassles that come with that, right?
yes,
However, the catch there is, and I think this is maybe where the confusion is, that it it's not actually a business, because if it was a business, it would have been liquidated by now, right? Most states would have been liquidated right by now, because
yes, yes,
they're
yes,
not run to they're not run in a way that benefits their customers, if you want to call the
yes,
citizens that. So there's this
yes,
kind of confusion about, even when you start realizing, yes, I mean, if you realize that, yes, the South African state is registered on the stock exchange, I mean, the implications of that are actually quite mind-blowing, right? To the point where people just don't even want to consider what those implications really are. I mean, I find that quite interesting. Paul, I don't know if you want to end off with your point.
Yeah, look, what's interesting in Jane Duncan's article is that where she ends off, she notes that there is a very, very tight determination of elite sourcing of news and um, what does she call it again? Elite. Bear with me a minute. And elites as the primary definers of news. Okay, all those points that she identifies in the in the diagram that I produced of her method, and she reflects on, how can that change. Okay, she identifies as a sort of alternative independent media, independent of advertising revenue, which has sprung up thanks to the internet as a technology has enabled that. And I know for a fact, because I look at a lot of the US based alternative and independent media. I think so do you. Um, but it's not only in the US, but I think I find the US a very good example of how prolific this is. And the reason why you often see censorship on platforms like YouTube and Twitter and all of that is precisely because the powers that be the mainstream political elites and economic elites want to control the narrative, and there is this alternative independent media and social media that threatens to undermine that control. So she is saying that is where the option for an ideological struggle, shall we call it, for what I'm talking about achieving, that is the option, the strategic option, where that is already starting to take place and can and should be engaged with and enhanced. And if you think about the implications of that, it's not just about the media, it's actually about the entire society, because you are trying to get to millions and millions of people with counter hegemonic ideas, with different ideas to the mainstream dominant elite ideas. And this project that I mentioned to you in Europe that I was engaging somebody about, of trying to build up the power and the networking of the independent and alternative media in order for them to start making inroads into mainstream media strategically, in order um, to 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 really expand outreach of these ideas beyond the fairly limited audience. I mean, it's a growing audience. Now, if you look at Rumble and Gab and all of these audiences on alternative platforms, I'm not trying to minimize the impact that they've already made, but it's still very, very small compared to the hundreds of millions that the mainstream networks in the US get through to. And as we see in South Africa, the SABC alone gets through to more than 100% of the media, viewership and listenership. And so that's where one has to aim to get the message out. And so that's what I see the role of people like myself or ourselves and what we're trying to do in a broader political context. Okay. And it's really defined around freedom of information. That's the common definition. That's the common political ideology. It's freedom of information. If we have that, then we can all come together and we can advance that common cause, whatever our other ideological or other focal points, our ideological differences might be. So I just wanted to leave us with that as a sort of concluding comment from my side.
Yeah, I think thanks for that, Paul. I think freedom of information, that I think you're right. Freedom of information is although that is what is parroted, freedom of information, free speech, all those kind of things. But I think, as I said to you earlier in the week, when the rubber meets the road, things don't quite work out as you would expect it when it comes to those particular terms. But you're right. I think freedom of information is important, and I think, look, reaching the level, getting alternative ideas out into the mainstream has always been the challenge. And I think you would reach a certain level. You reach a certain level, and you will experience quite serious pushback. And when I say serious, I mean serious, right? So that is interesting, and it's something we should keep talking about. And I think it is part of our theme as we continue to analyze the news and the news stories going forward. So thanks, Paul. We appreciate the discussion tonight.
Yeah, likewise, Mike. Thank you for your time. It was thoroughly enjoyable.
Yeah, great.
Have a good evening. Cheers.
Yeah,
Stay well, eh?
thanks. Bye-bye.
And a good vacation, eh?